Welcome, everybody, to Rutgers Center for Chinese Studies, also known as RCCS. I'm Tao Jiang. I'm the director of RCCS. You can visit us online, rccs.rutgers.edu, for all the upcoming events. We pretty much have events every week. You can also follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/RutgersCCS. I want to thank the co-sponsors for today's event, Rutgers Global, China Office, and the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. Their contribution makes today's talk possible. So now I want to introduce our guest speaker today, Amy Auberlin. I'm really delighted that she agreed to speak to us. Auberlin is a presidential professor of philosophy at the University of Oklahoma. She's an ethicist with specialty in early Confucian ethics, and she also does the ancient philosophy in the West. And she's the author of 2 books. Most recently, The Wrong of Rudeness, published by Oxford, which is, I was reading it, it was super humorous and fun and insightful. And today's talk will be partly based on that book. And also an earlier book published by Routledge in 2011, More Exemplars in the Analects. So today her topic is Civility and Manners in These Times, Early Confucian Strategies and Sensibilities. So without further ado, let me give you Amy.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me well enough. I wanted to thank Tao for inviting me and the Center for Chinese Studies for hosting all of us. Just to give a little context for the talk that I have, I've been working the last few years on Confucian accounts of Li, and in particular, how we might adapt these to our own circumstance, specifically with an eye toward the kinds of things that are transpiring in our culture. And so I began this work around 2015 and was only going to think about good manners. Then the 2016 election happened, and I thought, I'm not going to do this at all. And I wasn't going to investigate anything that would touch on political civility and so forth. But I did come back to it, and I wrote the book about it. And now I find myself in 2020 thinking, I don't know what I can say about this anymore. So I am going to be speaking today about things that I've been, trying to work on in a kind of public philosophy domain, things that are accessible to those who have no background in Confucian ethics, other moral philosophers, as well as ordinary people. But I want to acknowledge at the outset that some of my commitments here are a little shaky, just in terms of whether or not I think they can sustain the kind of pressure that I think anyone defending civility now has to experience. So I'm coming at it most basically as someone who still has the impulse, Tao, to be rude, maybe more so than when I wrote the book, and maybe just more basically unsure of just what we can collectively aspire to in terms of community and civic life. So there's a certain humility in what I'm going to offer here. What I mostly wanted to do, though, is to present what I take to be some of the key highlights of how a Confucian case might be made for civility, drawing on the Analects and Shunzi, as I see their promise for our own situation. So it's a very selective kind of sketch of some key themes that I think are philosophically evident in either the Analects, the Shunzi, or both. And so I'm going to be just picking out these themes and addressing them in a sketch-like form, and hope that if we want to have more detail about that could follow in the Q&A. And so I'm leaving out the things that might be historically interesting but are less relevant or less of interest to me at the particular moment that we occupy. So it seems to me that one of the most basic advantages of Confucian thinking about civility and manners is something that cashes out against our current popular discourse, and that is the first person focus of its discussions of Li. So we have civility, which I'm going to use as a partial translation of Li, as a profound element in self cultivation and in morally shaping the self. And it is focused almost entirely in the Analects in particular on a form of self cultivation, so that we have an interest in practicing Li as a way of shaping ourselves. And this is in contrast, obviously, to the kind of popular culture that we occupy now, where conversation about civility is almost always spurred in reaction to the incivilities of others. So the scandal of the day, the gasping shock of what somebody did, and then a kind of predictable cycle of condemnation and defenses of incivility that follow from that. But in our popular culture, one of the uh, uh, downsides of it, or one of the disadvantages we face, is that people hear invocation of civility as an invocation to condemn, right? That discussion of civility is almost always discussion of someone else's incivility. And I think that this breeds a kind of cynicism about civility that is in some ways well warranted. It gives ample supply of evidence that talk of civility is often just a cover for social dominance struggles. So that when we invoke civility in our common discourse, we're just engaging in ways of policing the conduct of other people, particularly of dissenters or disruptors, sometimes of the genuinely aggrieved, or it's just a cover for my side trying to dominate your side by shaming you about your engagement in various kinds of common practices. So, a first person focus on civility is salutary in part because it's going to turn our attention inward. So, if we map on to something like what the Confucians offer, we're going to see a challenge to greater reflection about what civility is meant to mean, the kinds of dispositions and values that are meant to accompany it. We have in the Analects, right? I mean, examples of Confucius as an exemplar where, the failings of others lead him to turn inward and examine himself. And it's also, I think, in a way that is therapeutic and beneficial, a kind of relief. I think that civility discourse in our current context is relatively poisoned, so that I before the pandemic I would give talks on civility, and I could expect some people to show up loaded for bear, because the assumption was if you're showing up to talk about civility, you're going to be retrograde and you're going to be pushing a kind of conservatism that will just stifle free expression, in particular of people who are oppressed. So I think that the focus on the first person cultivation of civility is something that is especially refreshing and needful in the context we occupy now. A second advantage, I think, of the Confucian case, and here cashed out explicitly with Western cultural philosophical tradition, is just the way in which Li combines what we treat as separate. So, in Western philosophical and cultural thinking, we tend to divide manners from civility, or at least we have since the 18th century. And we treat civility as a value of the public sphere. It's what those who are engaged in talk about the common good, or what we should value, or what kinds of disposition of resources we should have. It's a kind of agreement to disagree, and to do so politely and respectfully among those who are operating in a kind of public sphere. Whereas manners is very feminized. It is historically associated with women, with the domestic sphere, and with the merely private life. Now, of course, Li is a term that, I mean, we commonly are translating it as ritual, but I would argue that it's embedding ritual, manners, civility, etiquette. It's combining multiple terms. It also is not referring just to bodies of practices, but to greater values that are embedded in them. And I think its messiness is of value to us as a concept. Philosophers tend to want more distinctions rather than fewer. But in this case, I think we have artificially divided things that at least are continuous with each other. So our division of civility and manners into two separate spheres is not a wise one. It's not one that is native to actual life. And so it isn't something that stands us in good stead when we're trying to talk about the kinds of things that the Confucians would talk about in terms of cultivation of character and so forth. And of course, most of us, I think, intuitively recognize this because we find that our need of civility or our need of manners is something that is, transpires in the home, transpires in the world, and they're not readily distinguishable from each other. The personal is political, the political is personal, and the boundaries between them are not at all clear. And I think that the Confucian concept of Li, or at least what we would in the West treat as a kind of fusion of manners and civility, is something that actually promotes better thinking about what our target in fact is. But I think the most potent difference between Western philosophical and intellectual discourse surrounding civility and the Confucian picture is just the way we conceptualize what civility is doing. It is commonplace in many of the most prominent Western models of civility to think of civility as a kind of wall model, or what we might think of as an abstinence model. So that when I am civil, what I am doing is I am abstaining from dealing insult to the dignity and worth of individuals who disagree or whose values and life patterns are different than my own. So what I'm doing, in Clifford Orwin's idiom, is participating in a bond that unites honest men, each of whom is minding their own affairs. So it is a way to preserve a kind of distance between people. And Orwin does compare it to a wall, a way to say that there is a kind of boundary between us, or a space that you shouldn't cross. And I think that does, of course, make a lot of sense about the ways in which we may feel when civil norms are violated. We may feel as if a boundary has been crossed, right? Or someone has crossed over into a territory where they do not belong. They've tread on our dignity, they've tread on our sense of self-worth, and so on. But being civil and polite in these understandings is principally about not doing damage. It's about not undermining a free society of plural values and not violating the self-worth of individuals, each of whom is doing their own thing as I do mine. And I think that what's valuable in the Confucian model is that Li is not rooted in boundaries and our independence from each other, but in our sociality and dependencies. So there's a recognition that we're social creatures who experience a profound need of each other. And that profound need can be registered in multiple ways. One of these ways is just merely instrumental, so that the fact that we can convene in an environment like this, of course, relies upon the cooperative effort of uncountable others. Not just Tao, who hosted the meeting and made the poster, but whoever designed the technology, whoever is, helping power the grid, and whoever, built the chairs in which we sit, and so on, right? That our ability to act in the world and participate in the world in the myriad ways that we do is owing to all kinds of dependencies that run rather deep. And these are very instrumentally important to our well-being, as well as to the kinds of activities that we can pursue. But of course, there are also deeper dependencies, and the Confucians, I think, in some ways are much more interested in these, or at least Kongzi is, in contrast with Xunzi, but that we have inheritances of thinking and valuing that are derived from generations of human effort. So it isn't just that we are able to convene here because of the technologies that we have that rely on others, but that we are the inheritors of all sorts of traditions of learning, and the transmission of those traditions of learning, from person to person, from the mind to the page to the reader, and so forth. And those are very deep dependencies that we have as well. And then deeper still, I think the Confucians are committed to understanding that none of us thrive alone. And this might be something that is more immediately recognizable to us since the pandemic began, but that the value of that our lives are going to have for us will be rooted in many ways in what sorts of human bonds we can fruitfully form, sort of the people with whom we can spend our days, and with whom we will form lives that will have meaning for us. And so our sociality is not a trivial it's not a trivial need, it's not a transactional need, it's something that's very fundamental to how we understand ourselves. So we can understand a Confucian model of civility in contrast with that model that emphasizes our independence and autonomy. We can understand civility as a strategy for keeping all of this going, right? For keeping the dependencies working and keeping the dependencies operative for cooperation with each other, for all the things that we cannot, sort of under our own steam complete, for our own good development in terms of understanding and wisdom, our capacities to learn, and so forth, and for the stuff of joy and happiness, as well as our capacity to develop conceptions of what humanity means or what humanity can mean. And these are all part of something that I think the Confucians would understand is fostered by civil practices. Because we need each other, we likewise need ways to keep the social bonds necessary for cooperation intact. Good manners and civil practices can be understood as mechanisms by which we're going to signal our sociality and dependency. So that I am respectful and tolerant is not about recognizing you as an individual separate from myself and distinct from me, than it is about acknowledging the ways that we're connected and need each other. So we rely on social cooperation to ground our well-being, but our social cooperation in turn relies on our ability to get along with each other, whether that takes the shape of transactional things like sharing resources and working together, or whether it is managed through things like navigating difference and so forth. So our conventional civil practices, I think, in a kind of Confucian analysis of how we would understand them, how we would think about them, would be functioning as ways to signal our willingness or our openness to community and cooperation. Now, different sorts of social conventions will carry different shared symbolic meanings. So we could, parse this into different specific practices of civility and take them apart in a kind of functionalist way and say, what exactly is this expressing? What is it meant to communicate in our conventional understandings and in our shared social meanings? But more broadly, I think we could say that the social conventions will collectively, as the practices of Li or as our practices of civility, entail presenting ourselves as well disposed toward others and or well disposed toward sociality. So being well disposed is going to include most basically demonstrating or displaying that I care about not harming others, that I behave as if I'm steered more than my own personal concerns and aims. And it includes from the familiar stuff that most often is emphasized in Western contemporary discourse. So respect, consideration, toleration. So to behave well disposed toward another is simply to welcome interaction and involvement with them and to signal that in one's conduct, to treat them with something akin to how I would treat a person I am ready to like or for whom I will have humane concern. And so how we understand what is meant to be signaled in civility is meant to signal a kind of receptivity, a receptivity to engagement and cooperation. And I know many of you are familiar with the kind of dynamic with Confucian Li here, that there are at least two different ways, myriad more to be sure, to think about what the purposes are in terms of our practice in this way. One is just the one that I've mostly been emphasizing so far, which is communication. So that I want to be able to signal to my social partners that I am willing to be engaged as a member of a community, that I'm willing to engage as a co-participant in social cooperative action. But there is also the training function where making myself appear well disposed is something that can summon along my capacity to be well disposed. So that this is the feedback loop that David Wong describes, whereby my practice of Li is something that doesn't just flow forth from my internal dispositions, but is something that can inculcate just those dispositions. Now, I think that in terms of models of civility, I mean, one of the things that I sometimes think when I'm looking at Confucian materials in a comparative context against some Western sources is I tend to look at them in what is perhaps a naive way, which is which of these ways would I rather think about things, right? Which of these ways is a more appealing way to think about things? And I do think that the Confucian model that hooks into the both the pleasures and the needs that are fulfilled by our sociality is more inimitably appealing. It hooks into something that we are already motivated toward, often without any kind of effort or prompting. In other words, we all do tend to experience ourselves as needing others, as desiring the companionship and company of others. And so highlighting the ways in which civility fosters that is something that is hooked into something that we already want. And I think there are lovely passages in the Analects, of course, that invoke this, beginning with the very first passage in the text that talks about joy among friends, how Kongzi is content to die in the arms of his friends, and so forth. And this sense of a world made better through companionship and through fruitful, thriving relationships with others is something that can ground a kind of civil impulse, because it is something that is always sort of held out as the hope that we can have. But of course, a dependency model of civility, I think, is also catching at one of the truly hard truths, one that we see now, unfortunately, quite well and painfully, which is that we're actually tethered to others' independency. So our fates are locked, and often unpleasantly locked, with people that we do not actually like. And it doesn't seem, to me at least, or to be a strong enough or adequate appeal to talk about the kind of weak bond of agreeing to leave each other alone in our differences. Where something like mask wearing is concerned, we can't agree to disagree, or agreeing to disagree is socially destructive and problematic. Likewise, I think that we see that a kind of dividing ourselves into ideological bubbles or ideological closed spaces, silos, is something that does not tend to work. And so I think it's the dependency model of civility is very uncomfortably highlighting exactly the reason why civility might be important, by catching at the fact that we're effectively tethered to people with whom we have the possibility of cooperating or disaster. And I think that while this is a more democratically inflected way of putting it than Shunzi would, his commentary about the badness of human nature, I think, gives the effect of there isn't just the pull of civility from our desire for fruitful relations with others. There is also the effect of a kind of push into civility that comes from recognition that while it can be quite challenging to welcome sociality, at least some of the time, and with some of our fellow human beings, the alternative to this, to cooperation and sociality, is just horrific, right? I mean, that we're in a sense trapped in a situation where we do require others and not just the ones we want. So what human beings do and how they sometimes are can be exceedingly off-putting, and misanthropy is a perennial kind of temptation. And I think in Shunzi's idiom, one of the ways to understand civility is to keep us from entirely pulling apart, from displaying ourselves in ways that make cooperation something that simply has to be abandoned, and abandoned again to our own peril. So in thinking about civility as rooted in a dependency model, I think one of the things that we gain is something that illuminates in a way that to which too many are insensitive, the ways in which we are connected and bonded to others, whether we like it or not. And part of what civility is meant to do is to navigate us out of that. Now, this picture this sort of very quick sketch of how I see we could use certain Confucian conceptions of civility in a contemporary idiom is admittedly aspirational in some measure. And so I think it's worth sort of stepping back and thinking about what Confucian civility has to offer, where it's very difficult to aspire to anything regarding community, and particularly with one's own political opponents. I have been in recent months, as I've thought about Confucian civility, thinking about whether I still buy it, right? Whether or not I still can convince myself that it is something we should persist in attempting. And clearly there are instances where all bets are off, right? We have to say effectively that we're done with someone. But I think the Confucians draw that line far differently than most of us in our culture would instinctively draw it. So I want to think about what kinds of things can still be of value in this model, and that maybe even can work at that skepticism that civility is even relevant or valuable in a context like our own. And first of all, I have to admit, again, in a relatively naive way, but I think that it's very useful to raise the naive considerations often. I remind myself when I'm doubtful about this that it's not as though Kongzi and Xunzi are recommending this in an idyllic social situation. So, right, their recommendations for Li are coming out of a social context that is at least as hard as our own, certainly more dangerous to them personally in many respects. And I think it's worth sort of, for me at least, that's a way to kind of keep myself on the hook and say, it would be, well, I once had a student write a paper about Seneca. If you're familiar with Seneca, he was the Emperor Nero's tutor, eventually executed by Nero. And the paper the student wrote was entirely premised on the notion that Seneca had good ideas for his time, but that life is more stressful now. And when I'm looking at the Confucians, I'm trying to avoid my students' move and think, well, the Confucians didn't have the internet, right? If they'd had the internet, they would have abandoned civility. Or, if they had had a figure like some of our politicians, they would have abandoned this. So I'm trying to leave myself on the hook and say, you don't get off the hook for thinking this is valuable simply by saying times are too tough for that. But there are a few more specific elements that I think are salient in what they offer. One of the most promising, I think, elements of practice of Li is the kind of recognition that we find in Xunzi, most explicitly in Xunzi, although I think it's also latent in the Analects, that our experiences with others are going to be textured by what the people populating those experiences do. That things achieve their shape based on, in Xunzi's idiom, based on what they rub up against. Or he uses the idiom of a plant that is sweet smelling, but if you soak it in fouled water, it will acquire a fouled odor. And effectively, I think Xunzi's analysis of this, right? The suggestion here is that we are all susceptible to our circumstances. We're all susceptible to our environments, so that if our environment is coarsening or abrading, we become rough. If our environment obliges us to soak in what is foul, we become foul. So I think that one way to use a kind of Xunzian analysis to understand our own circumstance would be to kind of elevate the alarm about the social circumstances that we occupy, right? That we would have to acknowledge that what we are presently soaked in is something that can befoul our sense of humanity, that can befoul our sense of our fellow human beings, and we can better recognize the risks and try to steer ourselves away from them. But I also think it's empowering because one of the things that we can do with a kind of Shinzian analysis here is recognize that social atmospheres are not all alike for all people. So that it allows us a way to think about small slights, micro inequities, racially or gendered, bias inflected interactions, and the ways in which those may create social atmospheres that are corrosive to the ones who experience them. All right, so that in Shunzi's idiom, we can think about the ways in which kind of mundane expressions of racism, ordinary kind of prosaic expressions of racism, it can entail that some are obliged to rub up against a kind of sandpaper, experiences that are going to rub away one's ability to be confident in one's own humanity and one's own self-worth, as well as especially one's capacity for any sort of social optimism, the sense that you could be joined in fruitful community or cooperation with other people. So I think that a Shinzian analysis in terms of social atmospheres allows us to recognize one sort of the ways in which our atmosphere can be steered, but it also allows us to recognize the ways in which atmospheres are already steered and that they may be steered differentially. And we can better kind of capture the kinds of harms that are inflicted in those atmospheres of bias and so forth by thinking about the kinds of damage that I think Shunzi is alert to. On the more optimistic side of this, I've made the argument in some of my work on civility that the uniformity of good manners and of civility is something that we should see as a positive in terms of our social interactions. Kongzi has that claim that he makes to Yan Hui about, don't look at anything, don't listen to anything, don't do anything that violates the Li. And it used to be one of my least favorite passages in the Analects because I thought, oh, here we go, right? How do you defend that, right? What can we do with that? Because it just sounds so rule bound, so stuffy, just terrible. But I've come to think that there may be a kind of sense to it, particularly because it is to Yan Hui that the advice is delivered. So we've got to assume that this is Confucius bringing his best. Right, that he's not talking to one of his students who's slow and not picking up on things, but he is delivering something that we should take as pretty well grounded in his most ambitious ideas. And I think that there are multiple ways that we can think about this. One is just that if part of the purpose of the Li is to help us with disposition cultivation, then we will already recognize that disposition cultivation is going to profit from regularity and repetition. But I think that in our own context, we can also note that the sort of uniformity that's recommended here can promote other good ends. So if we understand the practices of civility to be practices that are designed as a kind of common symbolic language and behavioral code for communicating respect, then if we deploy those practices in a regular and uniform way, we are going to be far less likely to exhibit the kinds of problematically differential conduct that is prone to demonstrations of bias, right? That, I mean, it's a kind of truth in the literature on bias that uniformity is one of our ways of resisting exhibiting bias. And so uniformity in evaluation, uniformity in structures, we're interviewing job candidates and all these sorts of things. And I think that one of the potential promises of civility is something that if we are committed to and engaged in a kind of self-regulation under the auspices of Lee or under the auspices of civility, we're going to be far less likely to exhibit the kind of differential conduct that, for example, would have us be less pleasant to a low status person, to be disrespectful to someone based on their identity characteristics, and so forth. And so, a kind of model in which we treat the practice of civility as relatively binding, right? Things that we are not considering breaking or that we're not just enacting when we feel like it, we may reduce the possibilities that our conduct is going to betray unconscious biases. It, I read the passage with Kongzi talking to Yan Hui in some ways as a recommendation that we cultivate self-distrust, right? I mean, that there is a sense that the Li are more trustworthy than our own judgment. And I think especially where we are talking about the prosaic interactions of ordinary life, that's often going to be the case, right? That if we fly by the seat of our pants in our prosaic conduct, we're more likely to, be civil and respectful where the power differential works against us, and more likely to be uncivil and unpleasant where the power differential favors us. And this is always going to be a kind of problem. I also argue that one of the things that you get through the regularity and uniformity of Lee is something, a behavioral pause or a way of shaping your behavior that is conducive to epistemic humility where other people are concerned. One of the difficulties that we have in our own political and cultural context is the haste with which we are ready to identify others with a whole, kind of panoply of views based on quick impressionistic takes on who they may be. Some of the arguments I've made about this before hook into things even like clothing, which I'm going to make a confession here. I realized this morning that I didn't have any pants for this event because I am in the country at my family's farm. I am not where in my home at University of Oklahoma. And when I came here in March, I didn't bring any pants. All I have are overalls. And so I was very self-conscious about this and about how delivering a talk about civility in overalls might immediately trigger people into thinking, this is some retrograde, backcountry, redneck sort of recommendation that we should all just kind of stick to tradition. I asked perversely, I had given a talk in upstate New York before the pandemic started, and I was dressed professionally and had asked the audience, how would you hear this differently if I was wearing overalls and cowboy boots? And they all just laughed, right? Like, we wouldn't listen to you at all. Now, what does that have to do with what I'm discussing here? One of the concerns that I have is that in a social atmosphere and a political atmosphere like we inhabit now, that our tendencies to make quick judgments, quick impressionistic, stereotyping judgments about who our social partners are is something that is going to be amplified by the kind of stark divisions that we have in popular political culture. In other words, we're going to look at people and much more quickly identify, those are my kind of people. These are not my kind of people. And there is a kind of want of epistemic humility in that kind of move. It's inevitable that we're going to do some of that, right? Those kinds of judgments based on things like self-presentation, clothing, the various tastes that people have. I mean, people even have done research on this in email signatures, right? And what you can infer about people based on email signatures. But it can be a kind of social conscription wherein in our current environment, we encounter a mild or localized, discrete disagreement with a person. And from that, we infer that they hold the whole raft of views with which we disagree. And they become one of those people, one of those to whom we don't want to be bonded in community. We don't want to cooperate with them. We don't want to demonstrate respect toward them. And so one of the things that I think we get with the practices of Lee and the practices of civility is that where we are uniform in our conduct in terms of demonstrating that front-loaded respect toward others is that we hold open time for us to discover complicating elements about other people. In other words, we find out more about them, they disclose more of themselves, and it becomes harder for us to conscript them into being all that's wrong with the world. And so it slows down those kinds of quick epistemic judgments that we're making that are going to provoke us into putting people on sides, identifying people as opponents, perhaps prematurely, and undermining whatever promise we might have, however remote, of finding some kind of common ground with others. So I think these are sort of three aspects that I think are useful in terms of thinking about the Confucian picture and sort of what concrete practices of civility might do. But I also recognize that there's a limit to this, right? I mean, in many respects, I think being committed to civility now is being committed to something that is inevitably going to make you disappointed. It's going to take a great deal of restraint to have the kind of reliable civility that the Confucians are described. Or maybe I'm just rude, but at any rate, for me at least, civility now seems to take a greater deal of self-restraint than it used to. And I have a much more direct experiential sense of why Confucius or why Xunzi uses metaphors with a certain violence to them to talk about what we're doing. I mean, I experience myself as bent wood that does not want to be made straight. And there is a need for sort of force and really compelling myself to civility. The picture that the Confucians offer, and I do think they speak at least in some ways that are often idealistic, right, is that there may be some payoff to being civil, right? So that the self-restraint that we exhibit, the habituation that we have to civility may give us some power that we can exercise over our interactions, the way that we can steer social atmospheres toward better. But of course, it's not always going to work. So one of the ideas that I've been thinking about more lately is just the extent to which we can consider civility as a strategy for disappointment management. One of the, a book I hope somebody will someday write would be on the ethics of disappointment. It seems to me that disappointment is one of those human experiences that tends to be very morally fraught, right? That disappointment can render us mean, it can render us cruel, or it can simply spin us into despair. It can make us sort of give up the kind of hope that one has to have, however frail, as a kind of prerequisite to the kind of civil practices that the Confucians are envisioning. It seems to me that the Confucians here too have resources on which we can draw. And I think that civility might be, in some respects, given that it's a premise of my work that Confucius, Kongzi should be understood as a very disappointed person. So I'm not going to make that argument here, but I'll just stipulate that if you read Confucius as a human figure, as an exemplar whose disappointment is fairly profound, then I think we can start to see through examining Confucius as an exemplar what an ethics of disappointment might possibly look like, rooted in the sensibility of the Analects and the narrative figure that we find there. As such, I think that one of the things that you get with the model of Kongzi is, a sometimes mysterious but very potent reluctance to retract from a painful world. So there is a sense in which part of what you get with the practice of Li, particularly where Li is seen as, a bid to honor and sacralize human dependencies, where those dependencies strain and confine and pinch, is seeing it as positioning oneself first to chip away at that, right? So there's always the possibility that we may have we may have the power to shift the atmosphere toward better, and that in a sense is a win for us. But I also think that Kongza is um, more worried about the prospects of doing nothing to change the world than of trying to do something and messing up. In other words, there is not a um, kind of clean hands model here. Instead, there is the sense of if engaging with um, a feudal lord who is corrupt could get us somewhere, he's going to try to do it rather than retract from it. So I think that is one possible therapeutic strategy, is to look to Kongza as an exemplar. But I think civility in the practice of Li more broadly may be at least a kind of safeguard against letting disappointment have the kind of corrosive effect that it tends to have on human beings where they are disappointed in their sociality, either tempting us into misanthropy, tempting us into retreating into cosseting ourselves only with our own kind of people, making us retract from involvement in the social world, and so forth. But I also think that it's worth acknowledging that behaving well disposed toward others in the way that civility would require is also setting oneself up for additional disappointment. In other words, it's to live a life more risky, a life that is more open to certain kinds of disappointment as well as certain kinds of suffering. Because you can extend sort of the civil optimism that our dependencies can be recognized and that we can cooperate, and be rebuffed and be insulted and be treated with disregard or hostility or enmity. People just won't be steered. And that's just part of what civility entails. It doesn't always, Shunzi says, when one horse neighs, the other horses neigh back. But they don't always do that, right? They're not reliable in that. And human beings are not either. And so there's a sense in which civility, the practice of civility may, especially in a learner, exacerbate exactly the kinds of disappointments that civility would seek to address by building community. So in thinking about disappointment, I've lately also come to the idea, and this one is much more tentative, but I think it's just worth trying to develop a little bit. But I've lately come to wonder whether the Confucius emphasis on mourning could be used as more than just a commitment to mourning ritual as an especially important kind of cultural part of their traditional Li. It's tempting, to me at least, to think that the psychology of practicing civility in a riven world might profit from some of the same sensibilities that inform mourning. In other words, if we see mourning as kind of the practice above all practices, perhaps there's something in the psychology of that is important to Li in general, even to the mundane, prosaic practices of civility. So that civility draws us deeper into social hopes that will sometimes and badly be betrayed is a species of the risk maybe that a lot of virtues run. I mean, the courageous will find life harder for their courage because they don't have recourse to fleeing from peril. But civility is something that will keep you, treading troubled social ground even when others would stop, right? Because it's going to entail a resolve to prize your sociality, to prize human cooperation and dependencies, even where our hopes for human solidarity and fellow feeling are going to be rejected or even despised. So I'm trying to think through a Confucian account of civility that would recognize that civility is simultaneously often both ambitious and a failure. Right? That the kinds of aspirations on which civility is built are aspirations that are often frustrated or unavailable and unreachable. And this is what makes me think in terms of mourning as a kind of metaphor, because of course, mourning our dead can be understood as a form of resistance to unhappy reality, right? Where we're faced with a state of affairs and a set of facts that render us unhappy and that provoke suffering. At a most basic level, mourning is generated out of a longing that's very basic, even if impossible, that we want our dead living. They're dead and we wish they weren't. We want in grief exactly what we can't have, to go on together with someone who's lost to us. And so if the Confucians, as I would argue they do, in effect promote grief as one of our more valuable emotions, I think that this might be something that can be applied to the disappointments of community and civil interaction with others, to the disappointments at the heart of the aspirations that we have when we practice the Li. The misery of grief, grief for the dead, is effectively born in beauty, right? We grieve when we have been most well and surely bonded, and when the boundaries between our well-being and the well-being of another are often the softest. And part of what renders grief so terrible is that it's remarking a very profound longing in the heartrending absence of its proper object. And so, if you think of the Confucians as structuring mourning ritual as a kind of socially shared way to form and honor grief's longings, then perhaps one of the things that we can understand is it's a way to make sure that we still recognize that while death means we cannot have what we really want, mourning practices are our formal way to signal that we stubbornly want it still, right? That we pledge ourselves to a kind of longing that is inevitably going to be frustrated, and even when it exacts more pain than leaving off wanting would. So sometimes longing profoundly and disruptively for what you can't have is precisely what it would mean to be engrossed in its value. So mourning ritual recognizes this, right? Mourning ritual is stipulated on a sense that what we are expressing with our practices is a kind of commitment to expressing loss in ways that formally demonstrate our profound wish that the world were other than it is. To analogize from mourning ritual to civility practices, my argument would run something like this: that perhaps in some circumstances and even some eras, practicing civility just wouldn't be that different from mourning. It's a kind of resolve to practice open optimism in a world that is going to betray it. It pledges oneself against reality. It pledges oneself to prize longings that you lack the power to fulfill. In practicing civility and even profound disappointment, you're committing effectively to the same kind of wish that we find in mourning, to a rebellious, futile, but beautiful wish of sorts. And that would be that the world that the hopeful optimism of civility describes is a world that we still and stubbornly want, even when we can't have it. Now, that might not dissipate disappointment, but it might transform it. So that if we think in terms of how our current culture encourages anger as the proper response to our circumstances and even to our civic life, I suppose what I'm suggesting here is that there may be some morally therapeutic promise where we better able to acknowledge the great grief of it all. That it is an act of sorrow to be severed not just from each other, but from truly live hopes that we can someday soon have it be otherwise. And I speculate here that Confucius, at least, Kongzi at least, would be sympathetic to cultivation of a psychology that would see the ongoing practice of civility potentially possibly as a kind of mourning exercise, a way of lodging ourselves inside of a finer wanting than what we may get, but embracing the power of wanting it anyway. And those are my least formulated thoughts, but I'm going to leave it at that and hope that we can shift to Q&A.
Thank you very much. This is fantastic. So I think we're gonna now open up for questions. Right now there are two questions in the chat room. The one by Kathleen White and the other by James Anderson. Do either of you want to raise the question yourself? Just by unmute yourself and maybe identify yourself, your name and your affiliation, if there's any. I mean, you don't have to, but if you want to.
Yeah, I'll do it. I'm Kathleen Wright. I'm a recently retired professor from Haverford College. mostly trained in German and European philosophy, but now trying to understand Chinese. I'm interested in the issue of disagreement, how you disagree civilly, because we don't have that right now. And sometimes the framework of the family, you can have remonstrance, but you're not going to really have the inferior having sort of an equal status to disagree in a certain sense with the older parent or older brother, something like that. So I was more interested in sort of the fifth relationship of friendship, where it seems to me you can have disagreements between equals. So I'm just wondering what, Amy, thank you so much for your talk. What you think are the possibilities for civility and disagreement, with disagreements that are carried out in a civil way. What can we learn? That was my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that that I think is valuable in the Confucian picture, and this is all adapting it, because I don't think there's a lot that grounds talking about disagreement very well, because the text is so hierarchical.
Yeah.
That, you know, you kind of get the sense that, oh, you know, some of the disagreements that you find in the text are ones where Kongza, I'm thinking of where he's disagreeing with Zaiwo about the morning ritual, and he basically says, like, go and do whatever you want,
Yeah, right.
which is
Yeah.
akin to just saying, like, you know, go jump off a bridge.
Or you're hopeless.
Yeah. I mean, it's just saying that you're hopeless. And so because I'm more interested, I guess, in effect, not in the claims that the text would make about disagreement than I am about the narrative representations of it. Because I think the narrative representations give us a better sense that the context is always a huge part of how disagreement's going to be navigated. Because the hierarchies are the hierarchies that will be operational in our thinking are going to be variable and context dependent, and so forth. One of the things, though, that I think that you could draw from the text is this idea that that disagreement itself does not need to be fractious, right? I mean, in other words, that there are lots of ways within the boundaries of practicing civility to disagree with another. And one of the things, I don't know that I can ground this in Shunzi or the Analects well, but it seems to me that there's a case to be made for indirection as a conversational strategy. So that coming at disagreement through indirection is a rhetorical strategy that often allows a kind of space for disagreement that is not yet fully in the open. And I think that it's not fully in the open is something that can allow us to explore and navigate disagreements with other people without calling it quits. My great worry, I mean, this is all situated in terms of my own great worry, is that a lot of what I see in the world is people who disagree simply not engaging with each other at all. And so I think, you know, one possible strategy is strategies of indirection. I also think that there is that passage about remonstration then goes on to say, try not to become resentful. I think there's an implied psychology of disagreement there that recognizes that disagreements that are perceived as lost, right? I mean, because this is a child whose parents won't reform their ways. You've remonstrated with them, and then the passage says effectively, try not to be resentful. It's recognizing that, you know, failing in disagreement where we don't come to any kind of consensus or shared view is a breeding ground for disliking and resenting other people. And that's the principal psychological peril. I think that's a peril that is in effect run away with us at present. But that's, I think, the best I can do in terms of disagreement. Western philosophical sources, right, of course, treat civility mostly as disagreement management.
Right.
about how to, and I think that, you know, out of Confucianism, I think you can say a lot of the same things, that you be respectful in how you disagree, that you be considerate of someone else's feelings in how you disagree. But I'm trying to think of things that go beyond
Right.
those kinds of things.
Okay. I had something else that was very different, and I'll bring it up much later, let other people.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So we have James Anderson, and then Steve Angle, and then Keith Knapp. That's the next three. James.
Great. Hi, I'm Jamie Anderson. I'm an associate professor of history at University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and was so happy to just tune into this talk from a long distance away. My question may be pushing things too far, but I was wondering if going from the interpersonal to the interstate relations, the way that the Bingley, the right in the Rights of Joe, that kind of centered state relationship, is there a sphere of civility that would work at an interstate relations? And then I was positing that maybe in our relationships between the US and China, that some more of the Li could be practiced to be able to rectify a few things.
I certainly think that, I mean, in terms of Sino-US relationships, I think one of the great challenges there is just that the US does not have a strong cultural history of even attending to these kinds of things. I know that there's probably specialists at the State Department who, you know, give kind of those rush tutorials to diplomats about what not to do and how to avoid offending. But I'm not sure that there are sort of deep versions of this. I don't know. I mean, I think it would take more of a political theorist than me to try to address that.
Yeah, I think I was going a little further than what you were talking about. But
yeah,
I was thinking how the Bingley, I mean, it was the case that states did organize themselves around similar principles of reciprocity, and also and civility in that same sense of practicing ritual. But we've gone into a very different state of affairs right now. So
yeah, and I'm not sure that well, I mean, I just have to confess too much ignorance here, because I'm not even sure that, you know, what would the difference between states mean? What were the perceptions of difference between them? And that, you know, is it enough? And what do things like boundaries mean? Because clearly ritual is, court ritual and state ritual are practices that are, can be marking out territories, or marking out authority, or marking out modes of sovereignty and expressions of what sovereignty means, if sovereignty is a term we can use. And I'm not sure that I'm on firm enough ground to understand how all of that might play into the kinds of relationships we'd be discussing in terms of ritual, right? What Li could do in that kind of context, because the symbolics I'm not confident enough about.
Thank you, Steve, and then afterwards Keith, and then followed by Karsten. Steve.
Okay, hey Amy, this is great.
Hey.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Lots to talk about, but the thing that really struck me towards the end was when you were saying that Kongzi's exemplar doesn't encourage a sort of a clean hands model, but, you know, get in and get dirty, and, you know, maybe you mess things up, but you do your best. And it struck me that that's really different than, say, the picture that we get from Thomas Metzger and his talk about epistemic optimism. He sees Confucians as unwilling or uninterested to sort of engage in the messy marketplaces of ideas and politics and so on. And it could be that things just change, or that, you know, the personality of Kongzi isn't the thing that people later on are following, but rather the text in a more rigid way or something. But it does seem that there's a difference there between a sort of your remarks about disappointment obviously don't go in the direction of epistemic optimism. So I just wondered what your thoughts were about that.
To be clear, I'm only speaking about the Kongzi of the Analects as the narrative persona that you find in that text. And I think that, I mean, this is partly a function of my hermeneutics with the text. I tend to read the narrative passages as having not necessarily a priority, but a reality, or that they function as tells. So that, if you read the text with an attention to Kongzi's behavior, right, he's frustrated that he's not more involved in the world, that people aren't listening to him. He's got students who are trying to secure positions and aren't being successful. He's got students who secure positions and then blow it. So I guess I'm seeing this is what I'm referring to as a kind of disappointment, right? Is that Confucius, I mean, I have a paper called Confucius's Complaints, right? That is just focused on this, because I actually went through the text and said, look at how often he's complaining, right? And just saying things are not good. And I think that that's why I would argue against kind of the optimistic picture. I think the optimistic picture mostly comes from the claims of the text, where a Junzi doesn't worry, how can we suffer like this? Well, a Junzi can suffer better than somebody who's not a Junzi, and our virtue will prop us up, and so on. And I think that presented with what appear to be more spontaneous kind of outbursts of frustration versus passages that promise things that seem very chimerical to me. I read those passages hortatory, right? Those are the things that we tell ourselves to try to keep going. And again, this is just the Analects. I don't think that's where the later tradition goes, but I think there's a way to read the Analects where you see Kongzi as a figure who is trying to do something in the world, mostly failing at it, frustrated at times by that, and with his students in pursuit of consolations for that. And so this is why I think that, kind of the effort to, another way to put this might be, if we think of that image of the Kongzi and his followers as, unwilling to sort of participate in the messy marketplace of ideas. Another way to put that would be that they are, clinging to the idea that all this high learning still means something. That they're clinging to the sense that what they're doing matters, even if they are not fully in the messy marketplace. Because part of it would be like to think of, what does it mean to be in the messy marketplace now? Anybody want to jump on that? I'm not sure what that means. Does that mean that we as philosophers write op-eds? Does it mean that we get on comment threads on the internet and start slugging it out with people?
Join the board of ed.
Oh,
You got to do committee meetings.
Yeah, you've got to be involved in some, and that's the kind of type of involvement I think that I'm trying to describe, right? Is that one where you court frustration and disappointment by participating in the world that way.
Absolutely, yeah.
And yet I think that's what the text is after, is exactly that kind of activity.
Thank you.
That's interesting. So do you think Confucius would serve in the current administration?
That I don't know. I mean, I clearly, right, in the Analects, you have students who are trying to steer corrupt rulers or corrupt feudal lords toward better. So it's clear. I don't think Confucius is a purist.
Mhm.
There is a concern that you not go too far, right? In other words, that you don't want to be abducted by the corruption. You don't want the corruption to sort of become, you don't want to assist the corruption. But there's some space between avoiding that and not participating at all that I think Kongs is looking for, right? That you cannot, well, I'm in Missouri now. I live in Oklahoma most of the time. You can't join the school board in Missouri or in Oklahoma and not worry that you're going to be having to agree to things you really, in good conscience, don't want to agree to, or navigating relationships with people that you would rather repudiate. And I think that, to be a political actor in the world of Kongzi or of Shunzi would have been to court that, to recognize that you're always navigating and trying to operate within those risks, where you're trying not to be complicit in things that you should avoid, but you're trying to draw people along on some better path, or you're trying to draw them along toward community, and you're taking a risk. But it's a risk
Right.
that the text endorses.
Right, the relationality works both ways, obviously. So you can influence others, but then others will influence you as well,
Yeah,
right? So that's,
yeah.
which way lead the way. So that's actually the tricky thing. So next we have Keith, and then we have Karsten, and then Hagab.
Okay. Yeah. So, well, thank you very much for the talk. It was really interesting, and thanks for Rutgers for putting this on. I come from a shallow understanding of the Analects, mostly as a historical text. And, for me, I don't associate Lee with disappointment at all. Instead, it has this sort of magico-religious aspect where if you do all the rites properly, you then become a shining example, and people are transformed by it. They're transformed, and their behavior is automatically going to become good. And so that you just have to put yourself in the right place or do the right things, and it all automatically have sort of effect on especially those below you. And that where disappointment comes in is when, things don't go right. And then you have to, do the fanxing. You have to self-reflect upon where your errors are, because obviously it's something that has gone wrong with how you've performed the rites, and that if you do it right, that everything actually should go smoothly. And I'll refer not to the Analects, but to a historical text of the Discourses on Salt and Iron, where the chief minister is talking about, oh, geez, the Xiongnu are clobbering us at the border. What are we going to do? And the Confucians' reply is, oh, well, we have to perfect ourselves. And then, if we do that well enough, then the Xiongnu are just going to become docile and are going to stop bothering us. And so it seems that for them, that Li is something that that doesn't express disappointment, but it's as long as you get it right, that it can transform others, no matter whether they're, people of your civilization or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is I mean, this may be you're, as a historian, you may reject this philosopher's move, but I'm going to make it anyway.
Okay.
Or try to. And I would say that those passages in the text that appear to invoke the magical, mana-like quality that comes from practicing Li, being in the right position and so forth, that I think some of those passages are sincere, but I also think some of them are expressive of hope, and it's a hope that's more tenuous. So the one passage I think that kind of breaks everything for me is the one where Kongzi is expressing despair and saying he's going to go live with the barbarians. And then, this by itself is a concession that he's what, failed to perfect himself. His Li isn't powerful enough. He doesn't have the right he's not getting the effect that all those passages are promising, because he wants to leave because nobody's listening to him. He's asked, though, how will you stand living among barbarians? And he says, well, if I'm there, they can't be barbarians, right? They're going to reform themselves. I take that as wry self-denigration. I take that as Confucius engaging in a little bit of, sort of self-satirizing. He's failed in his own cultural milieu to have the effect that he wants. That's why he wants to leave. So to take him as sincere in saying that, well, look, if I'm there, the barbarians won't be barbarians, I can't take it seriously, right? I see that as a statement that recognizes that. I guess part of me wants to credit the ancients with a kind of sophistication that would not allow someone like Kongzi, who is serially failing at securing his aims, of having the kind of naive hope that you can just do the Li right and everything will work. Now, maybe that's a faith that the right ruler, right, that position is distinctive. But for a regular human being, or even for, the nobility, somebody like Kongzi, the idea that you could just do the Li correctly and you could have faith that there would be this magical power is something I find undermined in the text by the fact that Confucius's life goes so badly for him. In other words, he just doesn't win the influence that he ought to have if that worked. And I want to credit him with recognizing that. And I think there are passages in the text that he appears to recognize that. Now, in terms of Xunzi, I think Xunzi's entire discussion of human nature is a product of disappointment in some respects. Right? I think Xunzi is, it's easy to get disappointment from Xunzi. That there is a sense in which his descriptions of human beings veer from, at times it reminds me a little bit of Lucretius, the Roman Epicurean, because you read Lucretius and 1 minute he's discussing how terrible and terrifying death is, how vile human beings are, and then he careens over to discussing some beautiful pastoral scene, and it's all full of optimism. And Xunzi has that same kind of veer, I think. When he's discussing how bad human beings can be, you get the sense that, like, well, it's all hopeless. But then at other times he's talking about, how beautiful our practice of Li can be, or how powerful exemplars can be. And so I read that kind of careering mood as something that makes the text more valuable because it looks more like life, right? It doesn't have full faith in the kind of magical power of Li, but instead is, in a sense, unsteady, or recognizes that that's what experience itself is like, that our views of humanity, career from complete despair and misanthropy to hope and admiration. So.
All right, so if we take the Analects as not a single author text, but actually a multiple author text in strata, does that affect how you view the text?
I most often tend to read it as the received text and just say, whatever we want to say about the text composition, there is what was taken by compilers to be a coherent narrative persona here. Right. So, I'm not interested in the historical Kongzi. I'm interested in the narrative persona of Kongzi as he features in this text that is compiled. If he's fictional, it doesn't even matter to me, because I don't think it has to do with, sort of what the historical figure would have looked like. I think instead the text works to a greater or lesser degree. The later in the text you get, the more tenuous some of this might get. But there is a kind of coherent persona there. And I'm influenced by an argument. Christoph Harbsmeyer has an article, an old article now, that just talks about how, the Kongzi of the Analects is so different in some respects than the one that the tradition picks up and kind of runs with, that it's tempting to see him as a distinctively, this portrait as being more proximate to Kongzi himself. I don't know about that. I mean, I kind of leave that to the historians, right? But as a philosopher, I'm mainly reading it as a text that is positing a relatively stable and coherent narrative persona. And if you take the text as saying, as I would, you can, in some sense, reduce the message of the Analects to be like Confucius, right? Be like Kongzi. And if we take that as the message of the text, then we're looking to flesh out that persona, in a kind of exemplarist analysis, and say, how is he? Why is he the way he is? What does it mean to be like Kongzi? And because of that kind of reading, the oddities take on a new significance. So that if Kongzi is capable of expressing great disappointment and frustration, that's something that seems salient to our understanding of him as an exemplar. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So we have Karsten, we have Agab, and Ari. I think that we should probably just wrap up with Ari. Karsten?
So first, I'd really like to thank you for the talk. It's fascinating to bring the whole question of Li into civility in the contemporary world. That began stimulating a number of thoughts in me. And one of them that I'd like you to address is the whole question of civil disobedience. And I want to be a little specific, because civil disobedience can be an individual act, a la Thoreau, where it's simply a symbolic act, and it would fit very nicely into the civility paradigm. But it can also be massive civil disobedience, Gandhi or Martin Luther King, or right up to the present, in which the intent is not just to break the law symbolically, but to obstruct. And part of the purpose of obstructing is to basically say to the authorities, we're going to keep obstructing until you change, and hopefully get more people involved. And that's a kind of non-cooperation that even extends to the police, so that in a classical form of massive civil disobedience, people go limp. They don't, when arrested, they don't agree to go out. So you're not throwing rocks, you're not fighting, you're not doing violence, but you're clearly, in one sense, being quite uncivil, and uncivil on purpose. Although it's within the paradigm of the civil as a form of civil disobedience. So I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
I mean, this in some respects, I'm not sure I have any Confucian inflected thoughts on this. I mean, I think that I'm not sure that the Confucians would be as a form of dissent. I think what is from the standpoint of someone who carries deep dispositions towards civility, and the deep sensibilities and big values that inform civility, I think that's wholly consonant and consistent with the idea of civil disobedience. I mean, in some respects, if you take King's work, right, you have to care a lot about civility to be uncivil in this way. I mean, at least in the deep way envisioned. And there is a sense in which you are, kind of honoring the compact in your violation of it, right? You're breaking the letter to honor the spirit.
Mhm.
I'm not sure the extent to which we could say that the Confucians, or at least the Analects and Shunzi, give us anything to root a sensibility about that on.
Mhm.
I don't know.
Yeah. See, my thought is not necessarily what would Confucius say,
Right.
that, but if we take this idea of civility in the way you've developed it,
Mm.
then we have to think out,
Mm.
okay, so what does this imply? So let me just give one example. In Martin Luther King's letter to Birmingham, from Birmingham jail, he basically says to a lot of white religious leaders who say to him, you know, we agree with your ends, but you shouldn't do it in this way. What they're we could translate that into, you should be more civil in the way you're doing it. And he answers, there are times that if you be civil in the way you're doing, you're just allowing the evil to go on. And sometimes we have to break with that standard of civility in order to create the kinds of community in which civility would prevail. I think something like that is implicit in that letter.
Yeah.
So if we think it out, we need to do more than just say, okay, what would Confucius say? How would this concept allow us to think through that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the way that I have extended this, and I haven't gone far down this road, but part of how I've extended this in terms of thinking about things like dissent, one of the very unfortunate parts of our popular rhetoric is that it often seems that people conflate dissent with incivility, as if you're being civil, you can't be dissenting. Right, that the evidence of dissent is incivility. And so one of the things would be I would break that linkage and say, there are all kinds of civil ways to dissent. And when we're thinking about, I have a bit of a discussion on what I call righteous incivility, which is perhaps a kind of parent category to something like civil disobedience, where you effectively say, I'm not going to be civil, but the reason that I'm going to break with civility norms is because I think it's more moral to do so, right? That the morally correct thing is to not be civil right now. And so it's a morally motivated incivility. And I think the questions that come to hand with morally motivated incivility have to be what our motivations are for it. And so one of the issues in terms of our motivations, people often refer to their own incivilities with reference to their own integrity, so that they say, I simply can't do otherwise, right? I mean, to preserve my sense of my own dignity, or the dignity of humanity as I understand it, and so on, I need to break with civility, or to break the law. And then the other is the effect, right? I mean, one of the things that we are losing culturally is the great power of incivility to summon attention. I mean, one of the things that incivility, optimally should be able to do is summon people's attention, so that when we see people behaving uncivilly, we're drawn to it. We want to understand it. It's out of the norm, and we're trying to say, well, what's going on, right? Why are they behaving this way? And so one of the possible effects of things like civil disobedience is simply to summon attention. And to summon attention so that you can sound a moral alarm and say, things are not well, right? Things are not well with us, or things are not well with the world or our society, and so forth. And having summoned people's attention, to summon their moral emotions, right? To have them join with you. I mean, in other words, the person performing civil disobedience is optimally doing so out of a motivation that it's going to improve the world in some way. And so I think that, in terms of those kinds of sensibilities, those would be the salient things that we have to keep in mind. I mean, those would be some of the salient considerations. Because if I've got a moral motivation, or that I'm thinking of my incivility or my civil disobedience as morally motivated, then what I really want is for it to make the world better, or to seem to move the world toward better. And so I'm going to have to be kind of rigorous about whether or not what I'm doing does that. Now, I realize that this leaves out a lot of protest. And I'm not sure quite how to address that neatly, because I don't think that should be conflated with something like respectability politics or something, right? That we've got to protest in the way that the people in power like. I'd want to try to avoid that, but that's a start at that, trying to address that kind of issue.
I would just add to that there may be a level of civility within the civil disobedience. You're not going to name call, for example. You're going to try to evidence respect for the police, even if you refuse to be taken away. I mean, to refuse to go on your own steam and so forth. So there may be different level. You're doing uncivil in one sense, but I think the notion of civil disobedience still has some level of civility within it.
Yeah, it tends to have limits, right? I mean, it's a form of expression that tends to be defined. And you also find where you have communities organizing for civil disobedience, there's also civility in operation among them together.
Yeah.
Right.
So we have Hagab and Ari.
Hey, Amy.
Hey.
So I'll try to be very brief. I've always liked your, I love your curmudgeonly Confucius. But I do want to push back a bit on whether or not he's being, self-deprecating or sarcastic or something in the barbarian passage. So like, it seems to me that it's consistent with us recognizing his deep frustration at his own political failures, to also think that he's sincere in his belief in this transformational power of Li on a kind of more personal level. And so I think that, if you concede too much ground in the barbarian passage, it becomes tempting to question all the other ones that seem to talk about the effortlessness with which we can connect to people through Li. And there's abundant evidence in the text that he himself left this deep impression on other people. And I find it difficult to believe that he wouldn't have noticed that he wouldn't have noticed his ability to get good stuff out of his students or other people. So I think that there's a way in which it's consistent with acknowledging his political failures to think that he's sincere, at least in some of these passages. But of course, we'll never, who knows who's right about this. Yeah. So I have another question that is like not well formed. And so it has to do with this dependence notion. So it seems to me that, like, as an empirical claim, I'm curious what you would say, like whether or not, like, we just don't have that kind of dependency that existed in Confucius's time. And so that's partly what makes civility such a shruggable thing in our lives, because we're not forced to deal with people in intimate quarters all the time, in repeated iterated sayings day to day and month to month, that we live much more fractured lives, and we're not as nested in these intimate, familiar communities that maybe people in back then were, where they're living in multi-generational households, where all sort of like the events around the day are like group events, right? You show up and you have dinner together, and there's certain rituals that govern your life. And so that intimacy seems to me like to demand civility from you, because you're right, when you're dependent in that way, the only way to foster that is to put up with crap that you otherwise can just shrug off by saying, you know what, I don't need to do this. And so it seems to me that maybe that's what separates us. And for me, it's a sad thing when I think about this. I don't know if you agree, but when I think about this, it makes me sad, because it makes Confucianism just like less relevant to our lives, because it seems like we're less enmeshed with one another, because of various sort of socioeconomic and technological developments. So that's a very kind of big and ugly, kind of, not ugly, it's like a big question. I don't know what you're going to say about it. And so the final thing I want to say is, it seems to be part of the real belief in the Analects as a text about the efficacy of, my phone's ringing now. I think that's the food order coming in. They can wait. Philosophy must go on. What I was going to say was, like, part of what I really like about the text is a picture of a world in which Kongzi can tell his students, like, what about, have you studied the odes? Like, you can really win an argument or like silence somebody or get somebody on your side if you just quote the right line from the odes. Like, and so, like, there's this rich arsenal of stuff you need. And it's really important, I think, for the Confucian Project that this stuff be shared with the people that you're talking to, or else it's just inert. Like, it's not going to have any effect on them. And so, given that we live in these really pluralistic societies, I think it's just really hard for us to even recognize sometimes when people are trying to be civil with us, or when something they're saying carries significance for them, or is something very difficult for them to say, because we just don't share enough in common. I guess in a way, this is like maybe pushing against the idea that civility is as kind of like a uniform as maybe you were suggesting in the talk. But, like, so I grew up in this, like, immigrant community where, like, I was in this really enmeshed life where, like, all occasions were grand extended families, and, like, everyone in our community was a relationship to somebody, and, like, all of these things were really well mapped out, and in those sayings, like, people would remember these intimate details about people, and you could, like, invoke them to, like, make fun of somebody or to diffuse a situation. And there was this real kind of, like, intimacy and familiarity, and within that world there's this kind of richness that I think, like, it just is kind of lost when you're dealing with people that you don't share those details or that history or that tradition with. So I was kind of wondering what you think about those.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a kind of reflective of a kind of quest that I have, but let me build up to this a little bit. I mean, one is that in terms of the empirical claim and the dependencies, I mean, this may just be a difference of geography and experience. I mean, in the sense that I was just yesterday debating herd immunity strategy with my neighbor because he stopped by. The nearest neighbor is a couple hundred yards away, but this guy is like 4 miles up the road. And he was coming by because he has to come down our lane to count his cows. And my grapple was leaking hydraulic fluid. So I flag him down and say, can you come, you know anything about grapples and these hydraulic attachments? So he comes over and we're working on my tractor and we start talking about herd immunity strategy. And the whole idea here is that this guy is the route to getting my tractor from leaking all its hydraulic fluid out. And so we're fixing this thing together and we're talking about, he thinks, as he says, we just got to let it burn through. We just got to let COVID burn through the population. And this is not an idle thing because the latest 7-day positivity rate here is 43%. So it's in a bad way, right? So he and I are discussing this and it's horrible, right? Because he's echoing all this stuff that he's picking up on Fox News. And on one level, the conversation is horrifying because he's basically saying, people are going to die. It's unavoidable. I mean, this is a tiny little community, but there's tons of, as a percentage wise, there's lots of, the infection rate's higher than it was in New York at its worst, right? So he's saying this in a context, and I'm trying to think about that hook, the kind of hook you're describing where we are dependent on each other, right? I mean, he gets to his cows through my land. They graze on some of my pasture. He helps me out with my hydraulic fluid. We keep gas on the place just in case somebody in the neighborhood runs out because it's too far. You got to drive at least 15 miles to the nearest gas station. So it is a community where there's a lot of dependency, like material dependency on one another. If something catches fire, the nearest fire department's like 12 miles away and its youngest member is 72 because it's all volunteer. So you're completely dependent on your neighbors. So that's surely informing my thinking about some of this, right? Is that sense of dependency is hooked in. But I'm also trying to puzzle out, like, what are the possibilities philosophically for finding the kinds of things that keep us, kind of on the hook with each other? Because me and my neighbor, we can talk about herd immunity, but neither of us is going to, sort of forcefully repudiate the other. He's not going to talk to me like I'm a pointy-headed professor. I'm not going to talk to him like he's a Trump voting redneck. We're not, neither of us are going to like write each other off that way, because we depend on each other and so forth. And I think ultimately at a baseline, the common shared overlap has to be something like, you know, we all love Meemaw, right? Because when he starts talking about herd immunity, I say, how can you say that when your Meemaw is vulnerable? Because he has this beloved grandmother, right? Who's like legendary in the neighborhood. And I just have to invoke, you know, Meemaw, because it's like we all love our grandparents. One of the things that has stunned me though about the pandemic is how it used to be that within certain kind of cultural contexts, right, it might be enough where we could say even across pluralistic communities where, you know, we want to find the thread that can hook us together. And that thread might be something like, we all love grandma, right? Whoever our grandma is, we all love grandma. But this is why I say that recent events have challenged me, because I'm not sure we all do love grandma anymore. But it seems to me that the odes, or, you know, being able to sort of invoke the right things at the right time, part of making civility work now would be trying to puzzle out, what are the things we can invoke, right? Like, what are the things that we can evoke that not aiming for some kind of philosophical or moral universality, but what are the shared things? And one of my hopes would have been that the shared things would have been, you know, that like in my community and in communities nationally, that there would be alarms going off when the people at risk are grandparents, right? I mean, that grandparents has a cross-cultural purchase, maybe not universality, but that we care. But I don't think it's worked that way, so I don't know. But I think the goal would be the quest, right? To find the threads. Are there any threads that we can invoke that actually do still work that way? I haven't yet figured out what they would be. Grandma and grandpa were my best shot at it. And I think the pandemic has falsified that. So.
Wow. Okay, that's a really sobering thought. Ari?
Hi, my name is Ari Burrell from New York City. Thank you for your talk. This is a complete free association. You know, I think at some point in your talk, you mentioned the year 2016. And to me, that kind of hangs over this talk like a shadow in my mind. You know, it offsets the whole thing. And I do want to say that as things have transpired over the last 4 years, you know, I've noticed frequently that things I had kind of assumed were laws or legal structures were in fact closer to norms or conventions. And these norms and conventions are somewhat similar to Lee. And one of the meanings of Lee frequently is institution, is a kind of institution, you know. So that these many things have turned out to be not legal transgressions, but transgressions of norms and conventions. And it's made us realize, or made me realize, that how we depend on this kind of fiduciary community, fiduciary structure for so much that we didn't realize until we saw it broken, you know, and that, you know, people will try to repair it with new laws, yeah, but you know, will that work? I don't know. So that's one thing. The other thing is, you know, one interpretation of the Analects and Confucian thought in general is, you know, that Ren, humaneness, benevolence, humanity, love, so forth, that has precedence over ritual. So the tension between Ren and Li is very important. So, you know, of course, the significance of maintaining a mind of benevolence is always has to be factored into your decisions over and the degree of flexibility you have in applying Li. And later on, this becomes a big issue in the Song Dynasty about, and they use the term expediency, you know, Chen, balancing whether or not this ritual is applicable or not, and it goes back to some priority to that prior to Li. And the last thing I want to say is, you know, it's interesting because if we look in classical Chinese thought for the critique of ritual, you know, and we look at the Tao Te Ching and we look at the Zhuangzi, and we have open attacks on ritual as being hypocritical and a bunch of BS. And yet those critiques, is my understanding is, you know, those bodies of thought do not, I wouldn't call them ending up in incivility or or even maybe amorality is another, but somehow there is a critique of ritual without ending up, can I say, you know, where we've ended up. And in, you know, I don't know if in philosophical thought in pre-modern China, it would be pretty difficult to find this kind of open nihilism. It may or may not exist. I don't know. And I'm talking about pre-modern times. So that's it.
I do think that the breaking of convention, I have the same shock that you do post 2016 as to how many things were just conventions. There were things that I took as law that clearly weren't. And now if we try to repair the damage to the conventions and even to institutions through law, right, that I think the Confucian line would be that there's still something very profound lost, right? That the maintenance of convention as convention matters, that where it has to be supported in law, there's already a failure that has transpired. And so I think a kind of restoration of the convention, I don't know if it's possible to have a restoration of the conventions as conventions, or whether or not, you know, sort of repairing some of the breaches is something that has to be covered through law and code and so on. But I think if it does turn out to be codified in law, that's still going to make for a profound loss. As far as the relationship between Li and Run, there are multiple philosophical accounts of what the relationship between the two is. And I do agree that the adequate practice of civility or manners or Li is always going to have to include flexibility and fluidity, because there are circumstances that are simply unprecedented, right? The variety and multiplicity of human circumstances is too great to be captured by rules. This is why we have etiquette columnists, right? Who are trying to sort out what do you do, because the rules don't apply themselves, and the rules don't cover everything. And we all are aware that there are deeper purposes served by ritual and civility that are sometimes violated by following the rules. And so I think that in my sense of, you know, even when we talk about the uniformity of ritual being a factor, I guess I would still distinguish that from, you know, the more adept one becomes at practicing civility, the more likely one is going to be able to recognize when following kind of the convention or the code is more likely to wound someone or register as disrespect than the other way around. And so I do think there's a fluidity and a flexibility. I just think that most of us who are not Ren, who are not Junzi, right, tend to use that to let us off the hook, right? We tend to be too flexible. And so we end up applying the rules, you know, kind of only in situations where our circumstances summon us to awareness of them, which means that we're more likely to, you know, have the kinds of violations in terms of class and various kinds of bias that I was describing. So I think flexibility is built in. It has to be built in. But I think one of the things that you get with the Analects is this sense, I mean, with Confucius's autobiography, that it takes a lot of training to get good at the right kind of flexibility. Right.
Okay, I think we're way past time, so let's wrap it up. And then people, if you want, I'll leave this on for a couple more minutes. If people want to chat a little bit, then it's fine. I'm gonna stop recording. Well, thank you very much, Amy, for this wonderful talk, and then for all of you for participating. That just gives a lot for us to think about, and so this is really great. All right, thank you.
Thank you.